you ever been truly and utterly lost in the woods? If you have been, well, I was once because of a new hunting dog that took off, and we took after him and got all turned around. And if you're in that situation, you know what happens? All the trees start to look alike. Didn't I see that tree before? Wait, maybe it only looks, am I going in circles? And suddenly every pathway looks like it could be the pathway you should follow. And how do you know which way to go? Life can be something like that. How do you decide the best path for your life when you don't know where each path is going to end up for you? Well, we finally did make it out of the woods. Of course, I'm here, we did make it out. But we did it by saying, okay, we're not going to take the easiest path. We're not going to go in circles. We're going to pick one direction, and we're going to walk that way until we make it out of these woods. And miles later, we made it out of the woods, miles from our car, but we were out and we found a road. How I would have liked to have had a path, a very clear path that said, go this way, go this way. Do you have one in life? If so, where do you find it? This past winter, I did a lot of work up at a cabin, and the snow was very deep up there, sometimes way up past the knees, and you have to carry everything in, and you're slogging through the snow, and the best way is to try to step in the steps of the path that you've already made. Our text says you've got a path like that to follow in your life. It's not an easy path, but it's the best one. It doesn't avoid the troubles, the hardships, the thickets, the thorns, the difficulties, but it does get you through them. Our text says, Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. What is this example he's talking about? The word here, it's the only time it's used in the whole Bible. It's from the world of making books in those days, which had to be copied by hand, letter by letter. And if you were to want to copy a book, you had to have a good original copy. You couldn't have one that was missing any parts or had extra writing in there or anything confusing. You had to have a good, clear copy that you could copy from. But even so, mistakes can happen, right? You could go, here, and miss a word or miss a letter. Just like we want Christ to be our example, but in looking from Christ to our life, we can make mistakes in how we imitate him. But this word here, it's even better than a clear copy book. It's a copy that is so clear that you can take like a thin sheet of paper and put it over top and then trace the letters. And if you do that, you get every word, you get every letter, you get even the style of the writing. And in our life, we want our life to reflect the style of Jesus Christ and how he lived his life. But Peter, he says, this isn't going to be easy. I'm going to give you some very specific examples of how we should be following Christ, and we often do not. And the topic he zeroes in on is, what do you do when you are unfairly treated in life? Do you really want to copy what Jesus did in those situations? Here's how the text puts it. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they're conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and you endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example, there's that word, that you should follow in his steps. To this you were called. Jesus said, follow me. And you said, yes, Lord, you're my Savior. I will follow you. Only, do we really? One of the big complaints that I hear about Christians from those who are outside of the church is that there's not a whole lot of difference between a Christian and a non-Christian in how they live their life. So why should I be attracted to that? What sacrifice do they really make? What code do they live by that's any stricter than anybody else? You take a good person that's outside of the church and a good person that's inside of the church, and you put them close to each other, and you say, other than one is going to church, what real difference do I see between the two? And if there's not much difference, why should I be attracted to that? Well, here's one way to be more like Jesus in our text. Because Peter doesn't just say, oh, yeah, be more like Jesus. He gets very specific here. Consider, how do you react when people treat you unfairly? Because you know what human nature says? Human nature says, get even. Human nature says, oh, I got to tell somebody about this and spread it all around and make sure everybody knows how bad it was, what they did, you know. Don't let them get away with it. But none of that is what Jesus did. Our text says instead, but if you suffer for good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. The word commendable is literally grace. Like there's the grace of God in your life that's causing you to live in such a way that it's different from how you would have lived before because you know God and his undeserved forgiveness for you. You know the grace of God and you want to live that. That's the grace that's showing in you. And it's saying it's commendable to God. The way I picture it is, imagine a grandparent that's watching their grandchild, and the grandchild does something, and they say, oh, this is just like my kid used to do. Oh, look at that, you know? And they're real happy about it. When God the Father sees evidence of Jesus in you and the way Jesus would live, God is so thrilled with that. He says, like, grace is in this person's life. It's commendable. He smiles. He's happy. But I think that Peter, he's picking one of the hardest characteristics of Jesus to imitate. He's talking about the way Jesus reacted when he was brought to trial, when he was on the way to the cross. He did so without complaining. He did so without plotting. He did so without anything that he just took it. Peter writes, he committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He entrusted his life to his Father. He didn't retaliate. He absolutely could have. He didn't, complain about it or threaten and say, you better watch out if you're dealing with, 10,000 angels, they can be here. He didn't, threaten the people who were, he was so silent that Pilate was amazed. You're not acting like anybody else. Don't you know that I have the authority to free you or put you to death? I think this situation calls for wisdom because Jesus didn't always remain silent in the face of unfairness. Sometimes there was great passion. He's the one that overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple, So when do you put up with it? When do you do something about it? I think one of the best teachers for me in this area of life was our dog. We had a husky, and he was built for winter. He had 3 coats of fur. He had downy fur right next to his skin, and then he had regular fur in the wintertime, and then an outer hair coat that would shed water and moisture. He wasn't exactly soft. Petting him in the wintertime, a great fluffy animal, is kind of like petting a wolf, not real soft, except for his ears. Oh, his ears were the most velvety, bunny, soft ears. You just wanted to touch them, and he hated it. Did not want you to touch his ears, and I don't know why. But if you tried, if you're like petting this dog, and you say, oh, look at those little ears, and you touch it, zoom, he'd go away, and then, I don't like that, and he'd be gone. Except for my nephew, Mason. Mason could go up to this dog and just touch his ears, and the dog would say, oh, it's you. Okay. And he'd just sit there, because Mason was autistic. And Mason used to obsess over different textures to touch. And somehow this dog knew this kid, special case. Just like some of you who have a good dog that's like a good family dog, and a toddler can come up and do something, and you look and say, if I did that, But for a toddler, it'll put up with it, And I think that if a dog can say, okay, this moment right now, it's not about me, it's about somebody else, we can be the same way. I think maybe the situation is that if I am suffering unjustly and it's just me, it's an opportunity to be like Christ and a vessel of grace and to let grace rule in this situation. But if there's unjust suffering and someone else is suffering it, it's an opportunity to do something. I think maybe that's it. Because Peter, he's just focusing on it's just happening to you. And maybe the way you react, if it's different from what would be natural, would cause someone to think, wow, there's something different about this person. Christ gives us an example. But we have to really want to follow that example because it's not really natural. I was talking to a person once who had a pattern that they were supposed to follow. They'd gone to this event where it was something about drinking wine and painting pictures. Okay, and everybody was supposed to get together, she with her friends, and the picture they were supposed to paint was one that the leader had painted and put in front of everybody and say, okay, now you copy that painting. And everybody would start to paint, and they would look at how are you doing? Oh, that's kind of fun. Look at how we're doing there and compare each other. Only this person thought, I don't like that painting up there. If I did it well, I wouldn't want it. I think that's a dumb, boring painting. I don't want to paint that one. And so she painted a great big blue TARDIS in the middle of this landscape, which is like a call box in Great Britain. And the teacher walked over and said, no more wine for you. But really, in part, she couldn't see why she should want to copy that. Why do you want to copy Jesus in this area of life when it's against natural inclinations, when you might have to suffer for it? Why would you want to do that hard thing? Because if all Peter said was, you need to live this way, our religious life in this area would be about trying to live like Jesus until we failed at it, because we always will. But Peter does a lot more. He gets more to the heart of why do you want to? He goes on to say we don't just have a good example in Jesus. We've got a good shepherd who would lay down his life for us. He writes, Jesus himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, that we might die to sins and live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed. The welts, the bruises, the injuries done to Christ healed us because he took our sin away. And he gave us a new life that's eternal and a different life that is now. He actually says we die to sins. And once again, Peter uses a different kind of word, only used once in the Bible. There are lots of words for dying. It's a common thing, right? But this word means you were there and now you're not. Kind of like when we say the faithful departed or something like that. They were here, now you're not here. And the thought is that you are not all caught up in the common things anymore that you used to. Imagine if ghosts were real and you bumped into the ghost of somebody that you knew and you said, oh, you should see what they did to your house. And the ghost would look at you and say, what do I care about that? I'm dead. I'm not even around anymore. And Peter's kind of like saying, you died to the kind of normal life that people have, and now you have a new life, and you're living in the footsteps of Christ. You're striving to be more like him. And the closer you get to God, the more it's going to be like that. Last week, I was visiting someone who has serious cancer. And when I parked in that person's driveway, some business vehicle parked behind me and blocked me in. And he said, I guess you're here for good now. You're not getting out. And I said, tell you what, I'm going to take my car and drive across your lawn. And I'm going to go all the way out to the front and get to the road that way. And he looked at me very seriously and he said, ask me if I care. Go ahead. Go ahead and ask me. And I know for a fact that this person would have cared a lot not very long ago. But now, something is different in his life, right? Because he's thinking, I'm in a different spot. I'm saying goodbye to some of the normal annoyances and things in life that would have really upset me before because my life is in a different spot. And we too, if we're following Christ, our life is in a different spot than it. And that's, I think, what Peter is talking about. I'm dead to the way I normally would react. Now I follow the footsteps of Christ. And you do that, you won't be like everybody else. People will think, well, that person's different, but in a good way. Kind of like a self-controlled, kind of like a grace way. I don't know people who are that kind of control over themselves in such situations. For instance, can you imagine what it would be like if you didn't retaliate? because that comes natural. When I was a kid, there was someone who went up to the dessert table and got a big piece of blueberry pie with the sugar on the top of the crust there. And you know how that stains, you know. He got this big piece of blueberry pie, and when he came back to where he was sitting, it was kind of like a picnic type of setting. Somebody thought they'd be smart and play a joke and pulled the chair out from under him. So he sits down, it lands on the ground, and the pie goes all over Sunday clothes, shirt, pants like that. And the person who pulled the chair was all set to start it wasn't me, was all set to start laughing at him. What would you do if you were the person on the ground? You know, because the natural self says, get up and yell at him. You know, make him feel small. Hurt him. Physically, socially, somehow embarrass him, get back at him somehow, stand up for yourself, you know. This guy acted like nothing had happened, really. He got up, he started cleaning the pie off, you know, and the guy wanted to laugh at him but couldn't. Everybody was kind of looking. He ends up apologizing to him in front of everybody because it wasn't funny, because the guy didn't react that way. And I guarantee you, if he had reacted the normal way that first comes to our minds, he would have, you know, and there would have been this kind of a stand, oh, could you do this kind of thing that you see in grade schools, you know, or you see in adults too. Or another example. Let's imagine the impression you would make on people if, like Jesus, there was no deceit coming out of your mouth. Like, who could blame you if you told a little white lie that got you out of trouble, or that got you out of a sticky situation, or that got you out of being treated poorly, or that got you out of being treated poorly in an unfair way? You know, would anyone blame you? Probably not, because, you know, that comes natural, that way of thinking. However, Jesus, only truth came out of his mouth. What if we were different? It comes down to, are we striving to follow in the steps of Jesus, or are we making our own path, which is kind of wandering? Peter called it like sheep going astray. God calls you and me to something different, doesn't he? To a life of direction, a life of purpose, a life of impact on other people, because we act unexpectedly in a way that grace causes to exist in our life. Jesus didn't leave us in this world just to wander. He calls you and me to follow him. And when we do, we know we're on the right path. Amen.